A helicopter crew spotted a massive Bigfoot dragging an elk in a Utah canyon, and I was flying that aircraft. June 11th, 2019. Routine Forest Service survey over the Uintas, northeast of Vernal. 3 of us in a Bell 206, doors off, 200 feet above a remote drainage with no name on any map. My wildlife biologist locks onto something through his telephoto lens and tells me to bank hard. That's when we saw it. 8 feet tall, dark, reddish-brown hair, dragging a bull elk by one leg across pale stone like the animal weighed nothing. We hovered for 15 seconds, close enough to watch it pause, adjust its grip, and scan the ridgeline before vanishing into dense forest. The biologist's camera captured 6 frames. 3 corrupted instantly. I filed a report that night. My supervisor shredded it the next morning. My co-pilot requested immediate reassignment. The biologist left the state. I'm the only witness, still here, still flying over, country where something impossible exists. And the question nobody wants answered: what else is hiding in terrain we think we control? I've been flying helicopters in the Uinta Mountains for 14 years. Search and rescue mostly lost hikers, injured climbers, the occasional hunter who pushed too far into the backcountry and couldn't get out on their own. You learn the terrain that way. Every drainage, every ridgeline, the places where weather turns without warning. After a while, the mountains stop being scenery and become something you can read like a map written in stone and timber. Early June 2019, my supervisor pulled me off medevac rotation for a week. Forest Service contract work aerial surveys documenting elk migration patterns through the remote country northeast of Vernal. Routine stuff. The kind of flying where you stay low and slow, doors off so the biologist can get clean shots with his camera. I'd done it before. Easy money, and honestly, a break from the intensity of rescue operations. The morning we started, I met the crew at the airfield outside Roosevelt just after dawn. The co-pilot was a kid named Trevor, maybe 26, fresh hire with a forestry degree and just under 500 hours of flight time. Eager, asked good questions, but you could tell he was still getting comfortable with mountain flying. The kind of terrain we work doesn't forgive mistakes, and he knew it. He showed up early with his flight bag organized and his maps already marked. The biologist was older, early 50s, introduced himself as Dr. Richard Eng, state contractor. He'd been doing wildlife survey work across Utah and Wyoming for over 20 years, and it showed in the way he handled his gear, everything methodical, labeled, protected. Nikon camera body with a 400mm lens, field notebook in a waterproof case, backup batteries. He wasn't much for small talk, but when he did speak, it was precise, technical, the kind of person who'd rather let his data do the talking. We went over the flight plan in the operations building, spreading laminated sector maps across the table with our coffee going cold in styrofoam cups. 3 days, 6 sectors total, focusing on drainages where trail cameras had picked up unusual herd movements over the winter. The Forest Service wanted documentation numbers, locations, migration corridors, standard population management stuff. Sector 5 caught my attention when we reviewed it. I'd only flown over that drainage once before, maybe 6 or 7 years back during a search operation that got called off. No roads in there, no trails that I knew of. Just a nameless creek system hemmed in by vertical canyon walls and dense spruce forest. The map showed elevation lines packed so tight they almost blurred together in places. Why the interest in this one? I asked, tapping the map. Dr. Eng glanced at it, adjusted his glasses. Trail camera caught a herd of find. 40-plus cows and calves moving through in March. Unusual timing, unusual route. We want to see if they're still using it. Trevor was logging coordinates into his tablet, quiet, absorbing everything. He'd be handling navigation and GPS logging while I flew, and Dr. Eng worked the camera. Standard 3-person operation. We finished the briefing around 0700 and walked out to the Bell 206. She was already pre-flighted and fueled, rotor blades still tied down against the morning wind. I did my own walk-around anyway habit from the Army, checking things twice. Oil levels good, no leaks, control surfaces clean. Trevor pulled the doors off and secured them in the hangar, while Dr. Eng loaded his equipment into the back, everything strapped down and double-checked. By 0730 we were airborne, climbing east toward the high country. The sun was just clearing the peaks, turning the snow on the higher ridges into something that looked like hammered copper. Below us, the valley was still in shadow, dark green timber stretching out in every direction. It was going to be a clear day. Perfect visibility, the kind of flying conditions you hope for when you're working low and slow over rough terrain. I remember thinking it was going to be an easy week. The first day went exactly the way these surveys always go, routine, methodical, slightly boring in the way that professional work often is. We covered sectors 1 and 2 without incident, following drainages and ridgelines at maybe 500 feet, low enough for Dr. Eng to get clean photographs, but high enough to avoid spooking the elk if we found any. The rhythm of it becomes almost automatic after the first hour. I'd make slow passes while calling out landmarks and terrain features. Trevor would log coordinates and note the time, and Dr. Eng would work his camera in the back, the shutter clicking steady whenever he spotted something worth documenting. The bell's engine noise was constant, loud enough that we kept our helmets on with the intercoms live, speaking in short, efficient bursts. "Heard at 10 o'clock, Dr. Eng would say. Approximately 15 cows, 6 calves, moving upslope toward timber. Trevor would mark it. Logged. Sector 1, waypoint 7. And I'd bank us around for another pass if Dr. Eng needed a better angle. The landscape below was massive and empty in a way that still catches me sometimes, even after 14 years. Miles of forest, broken by meadows and rock slides, creeks running silver through the shadows, peaks stacked against the sky like something out of a painting. No roads, no structures, no signs that people existed at all, except for the occasional distant scar of an old logging road grown over with new growth. We spotted scattered elk groups throughout the morning. Small herds, mostly cows and calves with a few young bulls hanging at the edges. Normal behavior for early summer. They'd winter lower and push back up, into the high country as the snow melted, following the new grass and staying ahead of the heat. Dr. Eng photographed each group, called out numbers, made notes in his field book during the brief moments when we weren't actively surveying. Around 1400 hours, we stopped to refuel at a remote Forest Service helipad up near the Wyoming border, nothing more than a concrete pad with a fuel depot and a small equipment shed. A younger ranger was stationed there, maybe early 30s, and he helped us pump fuel while we stretched our legs and grabbed water from the cooler Trevor had packed. "How's the survey going?" The ranger asked, casual, making conversation while the pump ran. "Productive," Dr. Eng said. "Good elk numbers so far." The ranger nodded, wiping sweat off his forehead with his sleeve. "Yeah, we've been seeing healthy populations this year." He paused, glanced toward the northern peaks. "You guys flying the upper drainages?" "Some of them," I said, working our way through the sectors over the next couple days. He was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding whether to say something. Then, "We've been getting some weird reports from hunters up in the northern canyons. Nothing concrete, just strange stuff. Probably nothing, but keep your eyes open." Trevor looked up from his tablet. "What kind of reports?" The ranger shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. "Vague stuff. Sounds at night, things moving through camps. You know how it is, people get out in the backcountry. Imagination starts working overtime." He forced a smile. "Just mentioning it. I filed it away without thinking too much about it. You hear stories like that all the time in mountain country campers, spooked by elk moving through the dark. Coyotes that sound bigger than they are. Wind doing strange things in narrow canyons. Part of the job is knowing the difference between real problems and the kind of unease wild places naturally create." We finished fueling and lifted off again by 14:30, heading back south to finish Sector 2 before calling it a day. Thunderheads were building over the higher peaks to the west, dark anvil shapes that meant afternoon storms. Standard pattern for June. We'd have maybe 2 more hours of good flying weather before things got rough. Trevor logged our fuel stop and updated the flight plan while I brought us back up to survey altitude. Dr. Eng was already scanning ahead with his binoculars, looking for movement in the timber below. The work continued methodical, professional, uneventful. By 1600 hours, we'd completed both sectors and were heading back to Roosevelt with a solid first day of data. The thunderstorms stayed west, just close enough to watch, but not close enough to matter. We landed at the airfield as the sun dropped toward the peaks, turning the sky that particular shade of orange and purple you only see in high desert country. Trevor tied down the rotor blades, while Dr. Eng offloaded his equipment, and I finished the post-flight checklist and secured the aircraft. "Good start, Doctor," Eng said, packing his camera gear into a hard case. "We'll start Sector 3 tomorrow morning, 0700. I nodded, watching the thunderheads finally roll over the western ridges, lightning flickering inside the clouds like trapped electricity. Tomorrow, we'd push deeper into the range, into country I didn't know as well. Day 2 started the same way: coffee at the airfield, pre-flight checks, Trevor updating coordinates while Dr. Eng cleaned his camera lens with a microfiber cloth. We lifted off at 0700 sharp, climbing east into clear morning air. The plan was to finish Sector 3, then push into Sector 4 if time allowed. Standard progression, working our way deeper into the range. By 10:30, we'd completed 3, without finding much, a few scattered elk, nothing unusual. Dr. Eng suggested we skip ahead to Sector 5 while conditions were good. "Trail camera data shows the most activity there," he said over the intercom. "Makes sense to prioritize it." I remember hesitating. Something about that sector had stuck with me since the briefing: the tight elevation lines on the map, the complete absence of trails or roads. But the weather was perfect, visibility unlimited, and we had fuel to spare. "Copy that," I said. "Sector 5 it is." The landscape changed as we flew northeast. The drainages got steeper, the timber thicker, the signs of human presence fewer and farther between. We crossed into country I'd only flown over once before, years back during a search operation that got called off when the missing hiker walked out on their own. Even from the air, you could feel the isolation: miles of unbroken forest hemmed in by canyon walls that rose straight up from narrow creek beds. "This is the kind of country where things stay hidden, Doctor," Eng said, almost to himself. I dropped us lower, following a creek upstream into the heart of the drainage. The water ran clear over pale stone, cutting through stands of spruce so dense you couldn't see more than 20 feet into them. No clearings, no meadows, just forest and rock, and the occasional game trail barely visible through the canopy. Trevor was quiet in the co-pilot seat, scanning ahead with binoculars. He'd ask questions, normally, about terrain features, about the trees, about what we were looking for. But in Sector 5, he just watched. We'd been surveying for maybe 20 minutes when he spoke up. "Left side, near the water. You seeing that?" I banked us around, coming back slower. There was a cluster of young aspens near the creek, maybe 15 or 20 of them, and they were broken, snapped off at chest height, all of them bent in the same direction, like something had walked through and just pushed them aside without slowing down. "Could be wind damage," Trevor said, but he didn't sound convinced. Dr. Eng had his camera up, shooting through the open door. Wind doesn't break trees uniformly at the same height, and it doesn't leave them standing. I circled lower, maybe 300 feet now, trying to get a better angle. The broken saplings formed a rough corridor leading away from the creek into denser timber. Whatever made it had moved with purpose, straight line, no deviation. "Getting photos?" Doctor Eng said, "but I can't explain it from here." We continued upstream, following the creek as it narrowed, and the canyon walls pressed in closer. The shadows were deeper here, the spruce forest unbroken except for the occasional rockslide scar. I kept thinking about those broken trees, the way they'd all been snapped at exactly the same height, like something tall had just walked through without bothering to go around. The air felt different somehow, heavier. I know how that sounds, like I'm adding drama after the fact, but I noticed it even then. The way the forest seemed to swallow sound. The way the shadows under the trees looked darker than they should in full daylight. Trevor shifted in his seat. "How much further does this drainage go?" I checked the map. Another 2 miles before it boxes out against the north ridge. "Cell service?" "Not out here." "Why?" He shook his head. "Just asking." I made one more pass, slower this time, scanning the tree line and the clearings we could see. Dr. Eng was taking notes in his field book, pen moving steady across the page. The helicopter's engine noise echoed off the canyon walls, loud enough to drown out everything else. "One more run," I said. "Then we'll head back and cover Sector 4 tomorrow." I banked us around, dropping to 200 feet, following the creek bend through a narrow section where the walls closed in tight. That's when Dr. Eng's voice came through the intercom, clipped and strange. "Stop. Circle back. Now." I banked hard without questioning it. Something in his tone made my hands move before my brain caught up. Trevor grabbed the doorframe, his tablet sliding across his lap. The helicopter tilted, rotor wash flattening the grass below as I brought us around in a tight circle. "What have you got?" I said. Dr. Eng didn't answer. He had the telephoto lens pressed to his face, body rigid, leaning half out the open door. His breathing was loud over the intercom, short, quick breaths, like he'd just run a sprint. I dropped us lower, maybe 150 feet now, and followed his sight line toward a clearing near the creek. Boulder field, pale stone, stacked in rough terraces where an old slide had come down. Spruce forest on 3 sides. The creek cutting along the eastern edge. And then I saw it. The figure was upright, massive, walking across the clearing with a bull elk dragging behind it, one hind leg gripped in what looked like a hand, the carcass leaving a dark smear of blood across the pale rock. The thing was covered in hair, dark, reddish-brown, and even from 200 feet up I could see the width of its shoulders, the length of its arms, the way it moved with deliberate, efficient power. It wasn't struggling. The elk had to weigh 600-700 pounds, and this thing was pulling it like I'd drag a sleeping bag. "Jesus Christ," Trevor whispered. The creature paused, stopped walking, adjusted its grip on the elk's leg, and then did something that made my mouth go dry. It turned its head and looked up, not toward the helicopter, but toward the ridgeline above the clearing, scanning like it was checking for threats, calculating. The shape of its head was wrong, too large, too angular, but the intelligence in that movement was unmistakable. Dr. Eng's camera was clicking, rapid fire, the shutter sound barely audible over the rotors. I held us in a hover, watching, and the thing turned back to the elk and kept dragging. It moved toward the tree line on the far side of the clearing, powerful and unhurried. And then it was gone, swallowed by shadows under the spruce canopy like it had never been there at all. Just the blood trail remained, dark across pale stone, and disturbed vegetation where something large had entered the forest. Nobody spoke for maybe 5 seconds. The helicopter held steady, rotor noise deafening, and I stared at that tree line like the thing might reappear. "Circle again," Dr. Eng said, his voice flat, professional, like he was narrating data for a report. I brought us around, banking low over the clearing. The blood trail was clear. You could see exactly where the creature had walked, the path it took from one side to the other. But the forest was too dense to see anything under the canopy. No movement. No shapes. Nothing. "Again," Dr. Eng said. I circled once more, slower, and Trevor was leaning forward now, scanning the tree line with his binoculars. "I don't see it. It's gone." "It was there, Doctor," Eng said. He was reviewing his camera, fingers working the controls. "I got it. 6 frames. Maybe more." I climbed back to 500 feet, giving us distance, and my hands were steady on the controls, but something in my chest felt tight. Like I'd just watched something I shouldn't have been able to see. Something that existed in a category my brain didn't have words for. "We need to log this," Trevor said. "Official report. Document the location." Dr. Eng made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Document what, exactly?" "What we just saw." "And what did we see?" Trevor didn't answer. Neither did I. Because saying it out loud, putting words to it, felt like crossing a line we couldn't uncross. I checked fuel levels. Half tank. Weather still clear. But the light was starting to change. Afternoon shadows stretching long across the canyon. "Base, this is Survey 2, I said over the radio, keeping my voice neutral. "Possible wildlife activity in Sector 5. Large animal observed. Request. Permission to extend survey time for follow-up documentation. Static." Then the dispatcher's voice. "Negative, Survey 2. You're low on fuel, and weather's moving in from the west. Return to base." "Copy that." Returning to base. I brought us around, climbing out of the drainage, and nobody spoke on the flight back. Dr. Eng was hunched over his camera, reviewing the frames. Trevor stared out the window, binoculars forgotten in his lap. And I flew, hands steady, eyes forward, replaying those 15 seconds over and over in my head. The width of the shoulders, the way it moved, the intelligence in how it checked the ridgeline before continuing. We landed at Roosevelt just before 1700, the sun dropping toward the western peaks and thunderheads finally rolling in from the high country. I shut down the engine, completed the checklist, and sat in the sudden quiet trying to figure out what I was going to write in the incident report. Trevor climbed out without a word and walked toward the operations building. Dr. Eng stayed in the back, still reviewing his camera. "Did you get it?" I asked. He looked up, and his face was pale. 3 of the frames are corrupted. Digital noise, like the file degraded while I was shooting. He turned the camera toward me, and I could see pixelated blocks, color distortion, shapes that might have been something but could have been anything. And the others? Dark shape, suggestion of mass, nothing conclusive. He closed the camera, packed it carefully into his case. Nothing that would hold up to scrutiny. I watched him gather his gear, methodical and precise, and I knew we were both thinking the same thing. We'd seen it, all 3 of us. But we had no proof. We climbed out of the drainage in silence. Nobody spoke for the first 10 minutes. Just the engine noise and the wind through the open doors and the sound of our own breathing over the intercom. I kept the helicopter steady, following our flight path back toward Roosevelt. But my mind kept replaying those 15 seconds in the clearing, the way it moved, the deliberate adjustment of its grip, the intelligence in how it scanned the ridgeline. Trevor finally broke the silence. "What was that, Doctor?" Eng didn't look up from his camera. "I don't know. It was walking upright, dragging an elk. That wasn't a bear." "No, Doctor," Eng said quietly. "It wasn't a bear. I checked our fuel gauge, quarter tank. Weather was still clear, but the sun was dropping, and those thunderheads from earlier were finally pushing east. We had maybe 30 minutes before things got rough." "Did you get it?" Trevor asked. "The photos, Doctor?" Eng was scrolling through frames on the camera's display, his face close to the screen. He went through them once, then again, slower. Then he stopped and just stared. "What?" I said. 3 of the frames are corrupted. His voice was flat. Professional. Like he was reading data from a field. Report. Digital artifacts. Color distortion. The files degraded somehow. "What about the others?" He turned the camera toward me, and I glanced at the screen while keeping most of my attention on flying. Dark shape. Reddish-brown blur against pale stone. You could see something, but nothing clear enough to identify. Nothing that would convince anyone who hadn't been there. "That's it?" Trevor said. "That's it." "Doctor." Eng turned the camera off and packed it away, his movements slow and precise. Equipment failure. Happens sometimes with digital sensors in high-altitude conditions. But we all knew that wasn't what happened. The camera had been working fine all day. Perfect conditions. And then, in the one moment that mattered, 3 frames corrupted and the rest came out blurred and inconclusive. Trevor was shaking. I could see it in the way he gripped his tablet, knuckles white against the black case. "We need to report this. Official documentation." All 3 of us saw it. "Report what?" I asked. "What we saw." "And what did we see?" He didn't answer, because saying it out loud meant crossing a line, and we all knew it. Meant putting words to something that would make us sound crazy or naive, or like we'd made the whole thing up for attention. "Doctor." Eng was quiet in the back, making notes in his field book with careful, measured strokes. I caught a glimpse of what he was writing. Measurements, behavioral observations, anatomical details. Building a record even if no one would ever believe it. "The shoulders," Trevor said finally. "Did you see how wide they were?" I saw. And the way it checked the ridgeline, like it was thinking, calculating. "I know." The radio crackled. "Survey 2. This is Roosevelt Base. What's your ETA?" I keyed the mic. 15 minutes out. Weather's clear." "Copy that. We've got thunderstorm warnings for the high country. Glad you're heading back." I signed off and brought us lower, following the terrain as the landscape opened up and the tight canyons gave way to broader valleys. Below us, the forest stretched out in every direction, miles of unmapped backcountry where anything could be hidden. "We can't just let this go," Trevor said. Dr. Eng spoke up from the back. "We don't have a choice. No conclusive photos, no physical evidence. Just 3 witnesses reporting something that officially doesn't exist. But we all saw it. That won't matter. Doctor. Eng's tone was weary, like he'd had this conversation before. I've filed reports like this. Anomalous observations. Unexplained phenomena. They get categorized as equipment failure or misidentification and buried in a file somewhere. So we just say nothing? We file a report, I said. Neutral language. Large animal observed in Sector 5. Request for follow-up survey. Let the agency decide what to do with it. Trevor looked at me, like I'd suggested we ignore the whole thing. But I knew how this worked. The military teaches you to document everything and let the chain of command make decisions. You present facts, keep emotion out of it, and trust the system to respond appropriately, even when you know the system won't. We landed at Roosevelt as the sun touched the western peaks, the sky turning orange and purple, and the thunderheads finally rolling in. I shut down the engine and completed my checklist, while Trevor and Dr. Eng unloaded gear in silence. The airfield was quiet. A few other helicopters tied down for the night, mechanics finishing their shifts, the operations building lit from inside against the gathering dusk. I sat in the cockpit for a minute after the others left, watching the rotors slow and stop, listening to the metal tick as it cooled, trying to figure out what I was going to write in that incident report. Large animal observed, approximately 8 feet tall, bipedal locomotion, dragging elk carcass. The words felt inadequate, clinical, like trying to describe something profound in the language of paperwork. But they were all I had. I wrote the incident report that night at my desk in the operations building, long after Trevor and Dr. Eng had left. Kept it short, factual, no speculation. The 11th of June, 2019, 1,545 hours. Sector 5, survey operation. Large animal observed in clearing at coordinates 40.7821 degrees, north 109.5432 degrees west. Upright posture, approximately 8 feet tall, moving elk carcass. All crew members witnessed. Request follow-up survey and ground investigation. I printed it, signed it, and left it in my supervisor's inbox before driving home. The next morning, he called me into his office before I'd even finished my coffee. Tom Bridger, former Army captain, ran the contract operation with the same no-nonsense efficiency he'd probably used managing supply chains in Afghanistan. He had my report on his desk, reading glasses perched on his nose, and he didn't look happy. "Sit down," he said. I sat. He tapped the report with one finger. "You want to tell me what this is about?" "It's all in there." "Yeah," I read it. Large animal, 8 feet tall, upright posture. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "You know how this sounds?" "I know exactly how it sounds." "Then why put it in writing?" "Because all three of us saw it. Because it's part of the survey data. Because that's what we're supposed to do when we observe something unusual." Tom leaned back in his chair, studying me. We'd worked together for 6 years. He knew I didn't exaggerate, didn't embellish, didn't file reports for attention. "What did you actually see?" "What's in the report?" "Off the record." I met his eyes. "Off the record." Something dragging a bull elk across a boulder field, like it weighed nothing. Moving with intelligence. Checking its surroundings before continuing. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up the report and fed it into his desk. Shredder. The motor whined, paper strips falling into the basket. "What are you doing?" I said. "Saving your career." He shut off the shredder. "The Forest Service has no interest in this kind of publicity. You file something like this officially, it goes in your record, becomes part of your professional history, makes you look unstable. 3 of us saw it. Your co-pilot already requested reassignment. Said he's not comfortable flying with you anymore." Tom's expression softened slightly. "I know you believe what you saw. But the agency's position is clear. Bigfoot doesn't exist, so any report suggesting otherwise gets dismissed or becomes a problem for the person filing it. So we just ignore it? We let it go. You do your job, fly your missions, and forget about Sector 5. He stood up, signaling the conversation was over. "That's an order." I left his office and found Dr. Eng in the parking lot, loading his gear into a rental sedan. He saw me coming and straightened, his expression guarded. "Supervisor, shred your report?" he asked. "How'd you know?" "Because that's what they always do." He closed the trunk, leaned against the car. I tried recovering the corrupted image files last night. Ran them through forensic software. Every trick I know. Got fragments, dark shapes, nothing conclusive. What about the good frames? He pulled out his phone, showed me one of the photos. You could see the clearing, the boulder field, something dark near the tree line, but it could have been anything. Shadow, bare, trick of the light. That's all we have, he said. And it proves nothing. So what do we do? I sketch it. Document what I remember. Put it in my personal files with all the other observations that never made it into official reports. He opened his car door. I've been doing this work for 20 years. Bears, elk, moose, mountain lions. I know what they look like, how they move, what they're capable of. That thing the clearing, that wasn't any of those. Then what was it? Something the agency decided a long time ago doesn't exist on paper. He got in the car, started the engine. You should let it go. That's what I'm doing. Early retirement. Oregon job. Get out before this eats at me any more than it already has. He drove off, and I stood in the parking lot, watching him disappear down the road toward Vernal. Trevor was already gone, reassigned to a different crew, avoiding my calls. Dr. Eng was leaving the state, and I was alone with the memory. That night I sat in my cabin with my laptop, searching historical reports from the Uinta Range. Found scattered mentions going back decades, Ute accounts of forest giants, trapper stories from the 1800s. Modern sightings dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications. A pattern of witnesses seeing something impossible and being told it didn't exist. I kept searching until after midnight, reading reports that sounded familiar, descriptions that matched what I'd seen. And I realized Tom was right about one thing: filing that report would have only hurt me. But he was wrong about letting it go. Because I couldn't unsee what I'd witnessed in that clearing, and I needed to know what else was hidden in those mountains. 2 weeks passed before I contacted Dr. Eng. I'd been flying standard medevac rotation, extracting injured hikers, transporting patients from remote clinics, the normal work that paid the bills. But every flight took me over backcountry that suddenly felt different, less empty, more watched. I started noticing patterns in old incident reports stored in the operations database. Missing hikers eventually found disoriented, unable to explain 3 days of lost time. Hunters describing something watching from the trees, never seeing it clearly, just the sensation of being observed. Livestock kills attributed to mountain lions despite claw marks spaced too wide, bite radius too large. Patterns that suggested something else was out there. Dr. Eng agreed to meet at a dive bar outside Vernal. Dark wood paneling, neon beer signs, locals who minded their own business. He looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. "You still thinking about it?" he asked, sliding into the booth across from me. "Every day." He nodded like he'd expected that answer. Ordered a beer when the waitress came by, waited until she left before speaking again. I filed 3 anomalous observation reports over my career. Unexplained vocalizations near Flaming Gorge. Tracks outside Duchesne that measured 19 inches long. A structure in the high Uinta's wilderness that wasn't there the previous season. He took a long drink. All of them ignored, explained away. Filed under equipment failure or observer error. But you kept documenting. In my personal journal. Never showed colleagues. Never submitted the data officially. He pulled out a weathered field notebook. Opened it to a page filled with sketches. A bipedal figure with pronounced brow ridge. Long arms. Massive chest. Measurements annotated in the margins. This is what I saw. What we saw. The drawing was detailed, precise. Not the work of imagination, but careful observation. The way it moved, I said. Deliberate. Checking the ridgeline before continuing. Intelligence. Dr. Eng agreed. Problem solving. Threat assessment. Those aren't instinctive behaviors, they're calculated. He closed the notebook. I've been doing this work for 20 years. I know animal behavior. That thing wasn't operating on instinct. Then what was it doing? Surviving. Same as any species in remote habitat. Staying hidden, avoiding contact, moving through territory it knows better than we ever will. He finished his beer. The corrupted photos bother me most. 3 frames degraded mid-shoot, while the camera was functioning perfectly. like something interfered with the electronics. You think it was deliberate? I think we don't understand what we're dealing with. He stood, left cash on the table. I'm leaving for Oregon next week. University position, mostly lab work. Safer than field surveys in country where things watch back. You're running. I'm accepting reality. Whatever's in those mountains, the agency decided long ago it doesn't exist on paper. Fighting that only costs you. He paused at the door. Let it go. That's my advice. But we both knew I wouldn't. The hunting guide's name was Frank Colton. He reached out through mutual contacts, a SAR volunteer who'd heard about the sighting and mentioned it to someone who knew someone. Small-town information networks that operated on trust and careful discretion. We met at his property near the Wyoming border, a modest operation with a weathered barn and corrals for pack horses. He was early 60s, fourth-generation Utahn, with the kind of lean build that came from decades, working backcountry. When he shook my hand, his grip was colloosed and strong. Appreciate you coming up, he said, leading me toward the barn. Wasn't sure if you'd want to talk about it. Depends what you've got. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through photos, handed it to me. Found this 3 days ago. Same drainage where you had your sighting. The structure in the photo made my breath catch. Stacked deadfall logs, 8 feet tall, arranged in interlocking fashion to form a windbreak or shelter. Massive timber. Some of those logs would have required multiple men to move, positioned with precision overlooking a clearing. The same clearing where I'd seen the creature dragging the elk. I've guided hunts for 40 years, Frank said. Seen lean-tos, survival shelters, old trapper camps. This wasn't built by people. How do you know? Log size, placement, the way they're stacked, interlocking, weight distributed, and its position to overlook that boulder. Field. Observation point. He took the phone back, showed me another photo. Found these nearby. Tracks in dried mud, 5-toed, 18 inches long, sunk deep enough to indicate significant weight. The stride length was impossible, 6 feet between prints. You cast them? No. Worried about being labeled a crank, but I photographed everything, measured the prints before weather degraded them. He pocketed the phone. My grandfather told me stories when I was a kid. Forest giants in the high country. Ute elders had accounts going back generations. I always figured it was folklore. And now? Now I think the old-timers knew something we forgot. He glanced toward the mountains, visible beyond his property. That drainage feels different, like something's aware when you're there. I won't be guiding hunts in that country this season. You're walking away from income? I'm not taking clients into something's territory. Not worth the risk. He met my eyes. You want to? See it? The structure? I did. More than anything, I needed to see physical evidence that what we'd witnessed from the air was real. When can we go? Tomorrow. Day-long hike from the nearest trailhead. No cell service, no trails past the first 2 miles. Just game paths and timber. He studied me. You sure about this? I thought about Dr. Ng leaving for Oregon, Trevor requesting reassignment, my supervisor shredding the incident report. I'm sure. We left at dawn, Frank's truck rattling up a Forest Service road that turned to dirt after the first 5 miles. Then to nothing but 2 ruts through high grass. The trailhead wasn't marked, just a gap in the trees where game trails converged near a creek crossing. From here, it's all foot travel, Frank said, shouldering his pack. He carried a lever-action .30-06 across his chest, casual but ready. No cell service past this point. Storm moves in, we're committed until it passes. The sky was clear, temperature already climbing into the 70s. Early July, in the high country, wildflowers blooming in the meadows, snowmelt feeding the creeks, mosquitoes thick in the shade. We followed the creek upstream, staying on game trails when we could find them, pushing through timber when we couldn't. Frank moved like someone who'd spent a lifetime in backcountry steady pace, eyes always scanning ahead, reading the forest the way I read weather patterns. He'd stop occasionally to check landmarks, compare terrain to the topographic maps he kept folded in his shirt pocket. How far? I asked after the first hour. 5 miles as the crow flies. 7 the way we're walking. He paused at a creek crossing, studying the opposite bank. Country gets rougher from here. We climbed through dense spruce forest, the canopy so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. The air was cooler in the shadows, smelling of wet earth and pine needles. No trail now, just Frank's navigation and occasional game paths we'd follow for 100 yards before they disappeared. Around noon, we stopped to rest and eat jerky from Frank's pack. The forest was quiet, except for the distant sound of water and the occasional bird call. But there was something else underneath a quality of silence that felt heavier than it should. "This country feels different now," Frank said, not looking at me. His eyes were on the tree line above us, like something's aware of us. I knew what he meant. I'd felt it from the helicopter, that sense of being observed, evaluated. On the ground it was stronger, more immediate. "Your grandfather's stories," I said. "What did he tell you?" Frank took a long drink from his water bottle. "Said the Ute elders talked about forest giants in the high country, beings that move through the mountains like shadows, staying hidden, avoiding contact. My grandfather worked timber crews in the 50s, heard things at night that couldn't be explained. Footsteps, circling camp, rocks thrown from darkness. He said the old-timers knew better than to push into certain drainages. Did he believe it? He respected it. There's a difference." Frank stood, adjusted his pack. "We should keep moving." The terrain got steeper as we climbed, the drainage narrowing into a canyon with vertical walls pressing close on both sides. We crossed the creek twice more, the water running clear and cold over pale stone. And then, mid-afternoon, we rounded a bend, and Frank stopped. There. The structure sat on a slight rise overlooking the boulder field where I'd seen the creature from the air. 8 feet tall, stacked deadfall logs arranged in interlocking fashion to form a windbreak or shelter. The logs were massive, 12, 15 inches in diameter, weathered gray but still solid. Some of them would have required 3 or 4 men to move, and they were positioned with precision that suggested planning and effort. I walked closer, my camera already out, photographing from multiple angles. The structure faced the clearing below, where faint dark stains still marked the pale stone. Bloodstains from the elk. "Look at the placement," Frank said, pointing. "Observation point. You can see the entire clearing from here, plus the approaches from 3 directions. We found tracks in dried mud near the creek, 5-toed, 18 inches long, stride length measuring close to 6 feet. The impressions were deep, weight distributed through the ball and heel like something that walked upright. I photographed everything, my hands steady but my pulse elevated. Frank was examining trees near the structure, running his hand along bark. Here, and here. Claw marks gouged into the wood, parallel grooves too high for any bear to reach. 8 feet up, maybe 9. I felt exposed, standing there, watched. The forest around us was utterly silent, no birds, no insects, nothing moving except the creek below. That's when we heard it. A deep, resonant knock echoed from the ridge above, wood striking wood, deliberate and controlled. The sound carried through the canyon, unmistakable and impossible to dismiss as natural. 5 seconds of silence. Then an answer from the opposite canyon wall. Same sound, same deliberate rhythm. Frank and I looked at each other. He didn't say anything, just started walking back the way we'd come, moving faster now. We didn't wait to hear more. The hike out took 4 hours. We moved fast, neither of us speaking, and the forest felt different now, oppressive, alive with presence we couldn't see. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line, that primitive part of my brain convinced something was pacing us just beyond visual range. Frank never stopped watching the terrain, his rifle held across his chest, in a ready position. His jaw was set, expression focused, and I realized this man, who'd spent 40 years guiding hunters through backcountry, was genuinely afraid. We reached the trailhead after dark, stumbling the last mile by headlamp. Frank's truck sat alone in the clearing, exactly where we'd left it. He didn't speak until we were inside, with the doors locked and the engine running. "I won't be guiding hunts in that drainage this season." His voice was flat. Final. "I don't care what people think. I'm not taking clients into something's territory. You're walking away from income? I'm protecting people who don't know what they'd be walking into." He drove slowly down the rutted road, headlights cutting through darkness. "That knock. You heard it. That was communication. Deliberate. One to another, telling us we were being watched." I nodded, my throat dry. Whatever built that structure, It's intelligent. It planned the location, selected materials, constructed something that serves a purpose. He glanced at me. And it knows we were there today. We drove in silence for a while, the forest dark on both sides of the road. When we reached pavement, Frank finally relaxed slightly. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I don't know. Document what I saw. Try to figure out what it means. And if you go public, post the photos online." I thought about my supervisor shredding the incident report, Trevor requesting reassignment, Dr. Eng leaving the state. I'd lose my job, my reputation, everything I've built. That's why most people stay quiet. Frank pulled into a gas station, killed the engine. The ones who speak up get labeled crazy. The ones who stay silent carry it alone. That night at my cabin, I reviewed the photos on my laptop. The structure, solid and deliberate. The tracks, impossibly large. The claw marks, too high to be anything I could explain. Physical evidence that matched what I'd seen from the helicopter. I considered posting everything online, uploading to Bigfoot forums, sending to researchers, making the evidence public. But I kept hearing Tom's words. You file something like this officially, it goes in your record. Makes you look unstable. Instead, I thought about the retired Forest Service ranger Frank had mentioned, someone who'd worked the Uinta district for decades. Someone who might have context I didn't. I found her number through SAR contacts, called the next morning. Her name was Patricia Mercer, late 60s, retired 2015 after 30 years with the Forest Service. When I explained who I was and why I was calling, her tone shifted, became knowing, almost weary. "If you saw what I think you saw," she said carefully, "you need to understand something. This isn't new, and it won't be acknowledged. I need to talk to someone who understands. Then come see me. I've got files you should look at." She gave me an address in a small town south of the range, but be prepared. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. I drove down 2 days later, my own photos and notes packed in a folder. Patricia lived in a modest house with a view of the Uinta foothills, the peaks visible in the distance. She answered the door with a coffee cup in hand, studying me the way someone evaluates a witness they're deciding whether to trust. "Come in," she said. "We've got a lot to talk about." Her dining room table was covered with files, manila folders, printed photos, handwritten reports, decades of documentation. "There are things in those mountains," she said, settling into a chair across from me, "that the agency decided a long time ago don't exist on paper." Patricia spread the files across the table like evidence in a cold case, because that's essentially what they were. Suppressed reports, witness statements, photographs that never made it into official documentation. 30 years of incidents filed and forgotten. "The official position is that Bigfoot doesn't exist," she said, pulling out a folder dated 2008. "So anything that suggests otherwise gets explained away or buried. But the people who work that backcountry? Most of us know better." She showed me a report from a trail crew that found a campsite torn apart, gear scattered over 100 yards, tent shredded, food cache ripped open despite being hung 12 feet up a tree. The hiker was missing for 3 days before stumbling out of the forest, disoriented and unable to explain where he'd been or what happened. "Official report blamed a bear," Patricia said. "Never mind that the claw spacing was wrong, the bite radius too large, and the hiker had no visible injuries despite claiming something chased him through the timber for hours." I looked through more files. A 1973 incident where a ranger found tracks measuring 21 inches long following a remote patrol trail, dismissed as a hoax despite the stride length being over 7 feet and the impressions sunk 4 inches into packed earth. A 1997 report, Patricia's own encounter, I realized, though her name wasn't on the official document. She'd heard vocalizations while hiking alone, found tracks that measured 18 inches, and chose not to file a report after watching how a colleague was treated for documenting similar observations. "I kept copies of everything," she said, "just in case. Figured someday someone would need context." "Why the suppression?" I asked. "Why not investigate properly?" "Because acknowledging these creatures exist opens too many questions. Endangered species protections would close massive sections of public land. Logging contracts, grazing permits, recreational access, All of it gets complicated if we admit there's an intelligent primate living in our national forests. She refilled her coffee. Easier to deny, dismiss, and move on. I showed her my photos from the drainage, the structure, the tracks, the claw marks on trees. She studied them carefully, nodding occasionally like she was confirming something she already knew. You saw it in daylight, she said. From the air, with witnesses. That's rare. Most encounters are alone, at dusk, with no proof. She looked at me over her reading glasses. You're lucky, and you're stuck with it now. Stuck with what? The knowledge. The certainty that what you saw was real, regardless of whether anyone believes you. She closed the file folders. It changes how you see those mountains. Makes you aware that the map doesn't show everything, that there are things moving through country we think we control. We talked for 3 hours. She told me about patterns she'd noticed over decades, increased sightings during drought years when food sources shifted, seasonal movements that followed elk migrations, territorial behaviors that suggested family groups rather than solitary animals. They're intelligent, Patricia said, problem solvers. They avoid contact, stay hidden, communicate over distance. Everything we've documented suggests they're as smart as we are, maybe. Smarter in ways that matter for wilderness survival. Then why haven't we found bodies, physical proof beyond tracks and structures? Because they bury their dead, or carry them to places we'll never find. She showed me a report from 1981, a cave system discovered by climbers, sealed with stacked stones, bones inside arranged in patterns that suggested ritual burial. Forest Service classified the site, restricted access, and stopped talking about it. Before I left, she gave me copies of key reports, witness statements, photographs, measurements, documentation that would never appear in official channels but existed nonetheless. What you do with this is your choice, she said at the door. Go public and lose your career. Stay silent and carry it alone. Or find a middle path, document privately, support other witnesses, and accept that some truths won't be acknowledged in our lifetime. I drove home thinking about that middle path, about the weight of knowledge that couldn't be proven or shared, about flying over country where something ancient and intelligent watched from shadows we'd never penetrate. Patricia was right. I was stuck with it now, and there was no going back. Autumn came to the Uintas the way it always does aspen, turning gold on the lower slopes, early snow dusting the peaks, the air carrying that sharp clarity that means winter's not far behind. I was back on full medevac duty, flying rescue missions, as hunting season opened and people pushed into backcountry they didn't know well enough. I avoided Sector 5 whenever possible. When dispatch assigned missions near that drainage, I found reasons to adjust flight paths, take alternate routes, stay high and fast over terrain I used to survey at leisure. Other pilots noticed, but didn't ask. In this business, everyone has places they'd rather not fly. Late September, I got dispatched to extract an injured hunter from a ridge just north of the drainage fell. Climbing over deadfall, compound fracture of the lower leg, his hunting partner couldn't carry him out. Standard rescue operation, except the coordinates put me close to country I'd been actively avoiding for months. I flew in alone, doors on this time because weather was threatening. Found the hunters right where they said they'd be, small clearing on a ridgeline, orange vests visible from 1,000 feet. Landed, loaded the injured man, and was preparing to lift off when his partner mentioned something that made my hands pause on the controls. Something big moved through our camp last night, he said. A local rancher I recognized from the Roosevelt area. Heavy footfalls, steady rhythm, circled us twice, just outside the firelight. Bear? I asked, knowing it wasn't. Don't think so. Wrong gate. And there was a smell, rotten musk, strong enough to make your eyes water. He glanced toward the tree line. Heard a sound, too. Low, guttural, not quite a growl, not quite anything I can describe. I filed the details mentally and flew them out. Didn't mention what I knew, what I'd seen. Just transported them to the clinic in Roosevelt and completed my paperwork like it was routine. Back at base, I learned Dr. Ng had left the state. University position in Oregon, teaching rather than field work. Personal reasons, according to the official story. Trevor had transferred to a logging company in Idaho months ago, stopped answering calls from anyone connected to that survey mission. I was the only one left. The only witness still here, still flying over the country where it happened, still carrying the memory of those 15 seconds that changed everything. On a clear October afternoon, I flew high over Sector 5 during a routine patrol. The drainage was visible below canyon walls, dense timber, the creek running silver through shadows. And there, barely visible from 3,000 feet, the structure still stood on its rise overlooking the boulder field. Weathered now, slowly being reclaimed by forest. But still deliberate, still undeniable. I circled once, taking photos with my personal camera. Documentation for files I kept locked at home, evidence I'd probably never share. Then I climbed back to altitude and continued my patrol, leaving the drainage behind. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. About what lived in that country. About the intelligence I'd witnessed dragging an elk like it weighed nothing, checking the ridgeline for threats, moving with purpose and calculation. About the knocks Frank and I heard communication between individuals, telling each other we were there. Winter started early that year. By mid-November, snow had closed the high country, making ground access impossible until spring. I thought about the structure buried under snowpack, about tracks being covered and erased, about whatever called that drainage home, settling in for months of isolation where no human would disturb them. And I made a decision. I needed to go back one more time, before winter locked everything down, before I could talk myself out of it. I needed to see if they were still there. The hike would be dangerous solo, late season, weather unpredictable. But I'd spent 14 years flying search and rescue. I knew the risks, knew how to prepare, knew my own limits. More than that, I needed answers I couldn't get any other way. I needed to know if what I'd seen was an isolated moment or part of something larger, something ongoing, something that had been happening in those mountains long before helicopters flew overhead and would continue long after. Early November, I loaded my pack, checked my gear, and drove to the trailhead Frank had shown me. The forest was waiting, and so, I suspected, were they. I went in alone on the 7th of November, 2019. Early enough that snow hadn't closed the high country yet, late enough that I wouldn't encounter hunters or hikers. The trailhead was empty when I arrived just after dawn, frost thick on the grass, my breath visible in the cold air. I traveled light day pack with GPS, camera, fire starter, knife, emergency beacon, water, and energy bars. No overnight gear. In and out before dark. I knew the risks of solo hiking in November, knew how fast weather could turn in the mountains, knew I was violating every safety protocol I'd spent years teaching to SAR volunteers. But I needed to see if they were still there. The hike-in took 4 hours. I followed the route Frank had shown me, staying on game trails where possible, navigating by GPS when the trails disappeared. The forest was quiet. That late-season silence where most birds have migrated and the animals that remain move cautiously, conserving energy for winter. Early snow dusted the ground in shaded areas, maybe 2 inches in places where sun never reached. Fresh tracks stood out clearly, elk, deer, what might have been a mountain lion, and then, near the creek crossing, something else. 5-toed prints. Smaller than the ones from July, maybe 15 inches long instead of 18, but the same basic structure. Deep impressions in soft earth near the water, stride length close to 5 feet. I photographed them from multiple angles, placed my boot next to one for scale, and felt my pulse quicken. Fresh, maybe a day old, maybe less. I continued upstream, moving slower now, more aware. The structure came into view mid-afternoon, weathered but still intact. 8 feet tall, logs stacked in interlocking fashion, positioned exactly where I remembered. Some of the smaller branches had fallen away, and snow was starting to accumulate in the gaps, but the basic architecture remained solid. The clearing below was empty and silent. No blood on the rocks anymore, months of weather had erased that evidence. But the boulder field was the same. Pale stones stacked in rough terraces where an old slide had come down years, or decades ago. I found more tracks near the structure, circling it like something had inspected the site recently. The prints were clear in patches of snow too large for human, wrong shape for bear, that distinctive 5-toed pattern that matched everything I'd documented before. They led uphill into dense timber. I followed them, climbing through spruce forest so thick the canopy blocked most sunlight. The tracks disappeared on rocky terrain after maybe a quarter mile, but I could see where branches had been disturbed, where something large had pushed through underbrush. I set up a small trail camera on a tree overlooking the structure, knowing the odds of capturing anything were slim but feeling compelled to try. Then I did something that felt both absurd and sacred. I left an offering. An elk quarter I'd purchased from a processor in Roosevelt. 20 pounds of meat wrapped in plastic, placed on a flat rock in the clearing below the structure. A gesture of what? Respect? Curiosity? An attempt at communication with something I barely understood? I didn't know, but it felt right. I spent an hour sitting near the structure, just listening. The forest was utterly quiet, no birds, no wind, no distant sound of water, just my own breath and the occasional creak of timber settling in the cold. The silence was absolute. Not just quiet silent, in a way that made my ears ring. Dusk came early in November. By 1600 hours, the shadows were long and the temperature was dropping fast. I stood, shouldered my pack, and started back toward the trailhead. That's when I heard it. A single knock. Wood striking wood, resonant and deliberate, echoing from the ridge above. Closer than the knocks Frank and I had heard in July. Maybe 200 yards upslope, maybe less. I froze, listening. Nothing. Just silence and the sound of my own heartbeat. I didn't wait to hear more. I walked back down the trail at a steady pace, not running, but not lingering either. That primitive part of my brain screaming that I was being watched. The forest felt different now, alive with presence. I couldn't see, but knew was there. I reached the trailhead after dark, using my headlamp for the last mile, and my truck was exactly where I'd left it, covered in frost and surrounded by darkness. I drove home thinking about that knock, about the fresh tracks near the structure, about the intelligence required to observe, to communicate, to exist in country, this remote, without leaving evidence we could easily find. Whatever lived in that drainage, it knew I'd been there, and it had let me leave. I returned in early April 2020. Snow had melted except in the deepest shadows, and the high country was accessible again after months of winter isolation. I hiked in following the same route, moving faster now that I knew the terrain, and reached the structure by early afternoon. The trail camera was gone. Not fallen gone. The mounting strap remained, torn cleanly away from the tree. The camera itself vanished without a trace. No scattered pieces, no signs of animal damage, just the empty strap still buckled around bark. The elk quarter was gone too. The rock where I'd placed it was bare except for deep scratch marks, parallel grooves that looked like they'd been made by something dragging the meat away. The marks were fresh enough that I could see where stone had been scraped pale beneath darker weathering. I photographed everything, documenting the missing camera and the scratch marks, trying to piece together what had happened during the 5 months I'd been absent. Then, I found the hair. A single tuft of coarse, reddish-brown hair caught on a branch near the structure, maybe 7 feet up. The individual strands were thick, each one 3 or 4 inches long, and the color matched what I'd seen from the helicopter, dark reddish-brown with lighter tips. I collected it carefully in a plastic bag I'd brought for exactly this purpose, sealing it and labeling it with date and location. Physical evidence. Something I could have analyzed independently. The rest of the site looked undisturbed. The structure still stood, more weathered now, some of the logs showing rot where moisture had accumulated. But the basic form remained deliberate, architectural, positioned to overlook the clearing where I'd witnessed something impossible dragging an elk like it weighed nothing. I hiked out that afternoon and drove straight to Salt Lake City. Found a private lab that did wildlife analysis, handed them the hair sample, and paid in cash for expedited results with no questions asked. The report came back a week later. Sample analysis. Unknown primate hair, coarse texture, anomalous keratin structure, inconsistent with known North American species. Microscopic examination shows characteristics similar to great apes, but with variations not matching any cataloged specimens. Possible. Contamination suggested, though source unclear. Recommend additional sampling for verification. I read the report 3 times. Primate hair. Anomalous keratin structure, no match to known species. Possible contamination. That last line was the lab covering themselves, I realized, giving themselves an out if I tried to use their analysis for something official. But the technician who'd written the report knew what they'd found. The careful language, the suggestion of contamination, It was the same pattern I'd seen in every other official document that touched this subject. Evidence that couldn't be explained, so it got explained away. I kept the lab report in a locked box at my cabin, along with my photos, GPS coordinates, field notes, and copies of the files Patricia had given me, a private archive of something I couldn't prove but knew was real. I thought about writing an account, contacting researchers who studied this phenomenon, sharing my documentation, adding my testimony to the scattered reports that existed online and in fringe publications. But the weight of institutional denial and personal cost stopped me. Tom's words echoed. You file something like this officially, it goes in your record. Makes you look unstable. Trevor had requested reassignment and disappeared to Idaho. Dr. Eng had left for Oregon, choosing lab work over field work where things watched back. Frank had sold his outfitting business and moved to Nevada, walking away from 40 years of guiding rather than risk clients in country he no longer trusted. Everyone who'd been involved had made the same calculation. Silence was safer than speaking. So I stayed quiet. Kept flying medevac missions, kept my documentation locked away, kept the knowledge private. The hair sample sat in its plastic bag in my locked box, along with photos of tracks and structures that proved nothing to anyone who hadn't been there. But I knew what I'd seen, what I documented, what lived in those mountains, whether or not anyone officially acknowledged it. And that knowledge changed everything. Present day, I still fly the Uintas. Senior contract pilot now, training younger crews, teaching them mountain navigation and high-altitude operations. I never take them into Sector 5. When they ask why, I give vague answers about terrain complexity and fuel efficiency, technical reasons that sound professional and avoid the truth. On clear days, flying high over the drainage, I sometimes spot the structure from the air, still standing after all these years, slowly being reclaimed by forest. The logs are more weathered now, gaps wider where smaller pieces have fallen away, but the basic form remains deliberate, architectural, positioned exactly where something intelligent chose to build it. I've stopped looking for proof, stopped expecting answers. What I saw was real, whether or not anyone believes it. That certainty lives in my chest like a physical weight, something I carry every time I fly over backcountry that looks empty but isn't. The locked box at my cabin contains everything: lab reports, photographs, field notes, copies of Patricia's files, documentation of something that officially doesn't exist. Sometimes I think about my ex-wife's words from 3 years before the sighting: obsession with work and isolation. She was right, but she had the timing wrong. The obsession started in June 2019, watching something impossible drag an elk across pale stone. I think about the creature often. Its size, its intelligence, the way it paused to assess the helicopter before continuing its work, calculating threat levels the way any intelligent species would. I wonder how many others are out there, hidden in the folds of unmapped country, living in drainages with no names and no trails, existing in the spaces between what we think we know and what actually is. On winter nights, when canyon wind howls through the darkness, and the temperature drops below zero, I still see those shoulders in my mind. That methodical drag, the width of its frame, and the power in how it moved. And I know with absolute certainty that some questions are not meant to be answered, only carried quietly, like warnings no one wants to hear. Hunters still push into Sector 5 every autumn. Hikers still explore those drainages in summer. Search and rescue still gets called when someone doesn't come out on time. And I still fly over that country, watching the tree line, remembering what I saw. The map doesn't show everything, it never did. And whatever lives in those mountains, whatever I witnessed that June afternoon, in perfect visibility with 2 other witnesses who've all scattered to different states, it's still there, still watching, still hidden in plain sight. You can believe that or not, but I was there, I saw it. And I'm telling you now, as clearly as I know how, if you're planning to hike that country, northeast of Vernal, in the drainages where the maps show nothing but contour lines and unnamed creeks, bring someone with you. Stay alert, and if you hear knocks echoing from the ridges above, don't wait around to figure out what's making them. Just leave. Some territory isn't ours, no matter what the maps claim.